All right, welcome back to chapter 13. Part 2, culture. So culture can move, it adapts, it changes. And diffusion, spatial diffusion, is how cultural things move through space and time. Not like some science fiction show, but how ideas and concepts and culture adapts and changes. Okay? And we can actually map this. There's a pattern to this, right? So something new happens. And one of the best examples is popular culture or artistic culture. So let's use the idea of hip hop, of rap, right? In the 1970s, you started seeing young African American males in New York creating rap and hip hop. And they were the early innovators. And the people that went to the first shows, they were in this crowd. And over time, as their popularity grew and they started spreading out to other cities, you start having the early majority. So the first hip hop stars that maybe get a record on the radio, or you start hearing being sold, and eventually you start seeing it becoming a dominant cultural issue right here, the late majority, right? And then finally, to the point now where even I know what hip hop is, the laggards, the people that finally get it. And now it's at saturation level where it is basically as big as it's going to be. It is definitely part of the culture. But all things go through this fashion, language changes, um, fads, trends, cultural beliefs. Think about the idea of equality for women, right? The very first innovators like Susan B. Anthony, who lead this charge in the 1920s, we start seeing the movement to get votes, women the right to vote. And so by the 1950s and 60s, you start seeing this becoming more common to where today, very few people don't believe in this part. It's part of our culture. Now, this can vary. So normally what happens is, a great example also I would use this is hip hop. It starts in a major city, New York, right? So it starts right here. The innovation of culture happens here. And it doesn't spread evenly like anything else. It goes from the large cities to the second largest cities. It goes from New York to Boston to Los Angeles to Chicago and so forth. And then it goes from there to the smaller towns. So New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. And then from Chicago, Milwaukee, Green Bay. And now you can even look around the world and see how it's basically spread around the world this way. There's actually been a lot of studies of this, right? So hip hop and rap originates right here in the New York City area in the late 70s, early 80s, and gradually spreads. And the next large region that where it became popular was the West Coast, Los Angeles. And from there, the most current large scene here is Atlanta in the South. So it's spreading, and you have these different cultural waves of hip hop. So spatial diffusion, one of the other terms we talk about is the idea of paracme or paracme. Never can say it right. Paracme. So sometimes things become popular and then they become rejected. So another great example is fashion trends. 1970s, bell bottoms on jeans became extremely popular. The very, very wide pants legs. So much so that almost is identified with the 70s, but not the case so much anymore. Hairstyles come and go. Think about what you were doing in high school or junior high for the way you dressed and how you don't dress now. If I came to school dressed like I did in high school, well, first of all, if I could find the clothes that fit me, but second of all, you'd all laugh because that was a different style. So this happens in a couple ways. First one is symmetry. Something becomes diffused at the same rate it stops. And that can happen slowly or over a long time. So in the 1970s, there was this really kind of stupid, goofy trend. This guy put a rock in a box with little air holes, called it a pet rock. Just pour some water on it every couple days so it's drinking. It was stupid, but it caught on. It was trendy, and within the space of a year, they were selling like hotcakes. Everybody had a pet rock, and then after a while, people go, "Oh, this is just a silly fad," and it disappears. So it became as popular as quick as it disappeared. So you have a symmetrical curve. But you can have a thing where it takes a long, slow time to happen and then quickly drops away. And then conversely, you can also have it where it is adapted relatively quickly and a long time to fade away. So here, how many of you have seen these Lori Lightfoot memes, right? I just showed you one before where she's at the beach. Go home. Go home. I want you to think. This had a pretty quick diffusion. I'd say within the course of a week or two, you started seeing it all over the internet, all over. People were joking about it. Pretty quick diffusion. So what I want you to think about is think of these situations A, B, or C. What do you think is going to happen to it being not so popular? Is it going to happen pretty quickly? People are getting sick of it. Maybe they already are. Is it going to happen slowly? Right? So I'm thinking it's not going to be B. My guess, it's going to be A. I think pretty quickly you're going to see this disappear. And that's usually a trend we see with things like memes or fads. They usually fade away quickly. Some don't fade away at all. So it all depends. We can also use the spread of disease. And this kind of can illustrate some of the same things that move cultural practices, right? So in 1918, there was a strain of the flu called the Spanish flu that was extremely powerful. And what happened is this strain of the flu, first cases originate in the United States in March of 1918. And by the next month, it's a pandemic in Europe, Africa, Russia, and eventually gets to Australia in less than a year, about 7 months. Now, this was unheard of because it used to be to go from New York to Australia by boat would take you 2 or 3 months. Well, if you have the flu, in 2 or 3 months, either you die or you get better. So no one spread the flu. But because of improvements in travel with steamships and faster boats, that allowed people who had the flu to be sick long enough to spread it. And this was the quickest spread of disease in modern human history. It killed a lot of people. So it diffused quickly because of improvements in technology, which is something we see happening culturally all the time. The rise of the internet, the rise of television has allowed a lot of cultural practices to be disseminated and diffused much faster. In so much the same way that faster boats allowed diseases to spread. Now, I had to pull this in here. Looking at the global pandemic currently that we're undergoing, I found this. Hopefully it loads. So this map shows the spread of the coronavirus between January 22nd and April 9th. Each red dot is a case. The larger the dot, the number of cases. So the epicenter here is in China. So as of January 24th, they had 550 cases. And by January 24th, you had it in China, you had a few cases in Japan, you had a couple in Singapore, you had 2 in France, and you had 2 in the US. Now watch how fast this spreads as I start the map. And you can see the dots growing and getting bigger. And each dot is a number of cases. You can see the numbers rising. Just watch how the numbers start to get the dot. There we go. Italy starts to swell. The number gets bigger. The United States number now grows exponentially. And this shows you in real time how fast that disease spread and is actually, unfortunately, still spreading. So, as it plays again. Again, this is a good model for the same way that culture diffuses. It grows from one epicenter and moves. And it's also something important to see how fast this thing gets spread. Okay. So it's important to realize that culture is active. It doesn't stop. There is no point at which it was the best or the worst. Culture is constant. There's this old saying that you could never step in the same river twice because every time you step, the water has moved. And culture is the same way. Culture is an inherently flexible response to how we live. And the ideas and the people and the beliefs, they circulate globally. They are modified by local contexts. So how people experience culture here is not the same as they experience culture in France or China or Russia, right? Even if you are of the same family, families that move from Guatemala to the United States, their culture they bring with them adapts. And so this idea of territorialization of culture is connected to where it is. That's the culture regions, right? What people do in, let's use Mexico for culture when it comes to food, is different anywhere else but Mexico. Now, people from Mexico move. People from all over the world move. And when people come to another country, they bring their culture with them. That's deterritorialization. So Mexican immigrants came to the United States and brought their culture from Mexico with them. right? And let's use food as an example, right? Mexican food before the 1960s and 70s was not a very common phenomenon in the United States. But as we see more and more immigration, this becomes more common. But if you've ever been to a Mexican restaurant in the United States, there are adaptations. So how many Mexican restaurants have hamburguesas on the menu, right? The hamburger is an inherently American food, even though it's named for a city in Germany. But you don't have hamburguesas in Mexico because in Mexico, hamburguesa is the Spanish made-up word for hamburger, right? Ground beef in Spanish isn't ground beefa, so it's an American adaptation. Another really obvious example would be the Mexican restaurant having an English menu. If you're in a country that speaks English, you're going to adapt to it. That is all what we call reterritorialization. How does culture adapt to where it has moved? When we see cultures and people move around the world, we see lots of cases of this. Okay, and this just shows you the importance of international migration. The United States, our entire culture in many ways is shaped by the vast number of different cultures that have been reterritorialized here. In this country, right, we had the original Native American cultures that intermingled and mixed or superseded with the English colonial culture, the Spanish and Hispanic culture, and the Asian and African cultures that have all been brought here as well. And all those cultures were originally in another territory, came here and remixed, reterritorialized. And so again, I use the idea of hip hop. Now, hip hop is uniquely American, but yet it has been moved around the world and diffused. And it has been integral in shaping the culture in other countries as well. You go to almost any country in the world, and they will have their own, in a sense, native version of hip hop that's been incorporated into the culture. Another great example of how cultures change is architecture. Because architecture is the way we design buildings and how we live and how we choose what to build. And so that reflects the culture. So vernacular architecture is a great example. Vernacular architecture is the type of that where we use local building materials. We build specific to the local weather. So people who live near the North Pole and the far north building igloos in the winter using snow, right? Because there's very few trees to build a house. Or people who live in forests building log cabins. So this right here is a great example of vernacular agriculture. This right here, you can see is Luke Skywalker, and he's here on his native planet of Tatooine, which is a desert planet with 3 suns. And if you don't know what Star Wars is, then I can't believe you're in my class. But you can see this adaptation. And you may think, oh, well, a science fiction movie, but this is actually a real building in Tunisia. Tunisia is a very hot, dry desert. And the ground here, there's very few trees because there's little water. So to build houses, people discovered that the dirt here, the sand, was very hard and could be easily dug up, but it would hold its shape. And they basically dug their houses in pits. Nice and dark and cool during the day, and you didn't need as much wood. So this is actually a real building that was used as a movie set when they filmed Star Wars. You can actually rent a room in this hotel, and this is what it looks like on the inside. Although the robots and the lightsabers aren't included. Another type of architecture, the transnational. These are architectural styles that can cross cultures. They transcend place and time. So if you don't know what this building is, this is the Parthenon, which is in Athens, Greece. The very famous columns and pillars. But this might look familiar to you because it's also been adopted as the inspiration for neoclassical architecture. This is the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. Many large government buildings have these stone columns or pillars. City Hall in Chicago has them. And why do we do that? The idea was when we were founding the country and we were one of the first republics in the world, that Athens, Greece is considered the birthplace of democracy. It's one of the first democratic governments back thousands of years ago. And so we were, in a sense, appropriating their architecture to make that statement that we are part of a long line of democracies. And neoclassical architecture, which is the style for most federal government offices, think about the White House, think about the U.S. Capitol, they borrow heavily from that. I find it interesting on a side note that most of our buildings that borrow that kind of traditional culture are this kind of white marble, kind of very pure looking stone design. But the ancient Greeks actually painted these things bright neon day-glow colors. They loved it. But because the paint has faded over thousands of years, This is what we see, and that's what we borrow. Another example after that was the idea of modernist designs. And if you don't recognize this, this right here is downtown Chicago. This is the Flamingo, which is a modernist sculpture by Alexander Calder. This is the Federal Courthouse. Modernist designs actually originate in Chicago in the 1950s. German architect by the name of Mies van der Rohe fled Nazi Germany. His designs were not in favor. He designed these styles. These buildings, very plain, just steel and glass, straight lines, no decoration, no ornamentation. The idea was that these buildings would be formless and placeless. You could put them anywhere, and that you wouldn't know if this was a government office or a home or a hospital, right? To make all things equal in a sense. So you see these tall, flat top buildings. But by the 1960s and 70s, many people had been tired of this and felt that they were boring, and the cultural realization of what architecture was adapted. And so you see this rise in the idea of the postmodern. These buildings that are made to look old, but they use modern features. This is the Harold Washington Public Library. It looks like an old 1890s building with the ornate stonework, these big, huge gargoyles on the corner, and again, brand new and modern, but trying to be kind of whimsical, a reaction to the cold, straight lines. Okay. You take that a step further and you have deconstructionism where you don't have any straight lines. This is the Pritzker Pavilion here in Millennium Park, right down the street from us. I'm imagining that we're all in school, so bear with me. Right? And this whole idea, no straight lines, very whimsical, very playful, it was actually designed to look like the conception of what maybe feathers on a headdress would look like, kind of flowy and curvy. All right, I'm going to pause this lecture right here, and we'll come back with part 3 in just a little bit.